Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, School Safety, 5 High Liability Issues for Public Schools. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for your educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law, since the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Dale will discuss lack of accurate understanding of safety issues, reaction, not prediction, poor management of schools, lack of effective plans to combat truancy and lateness, poor emergency management. To give you a little background about our presenter, Dale Yeager is a forensic profiler and Federal SME with training by the United States Department of Justice and Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Mr. Yeager is a frequent expert with media outlets, including a featured episode of Forensic Files and a new History Channel series entitled True Monsters. Dale is also a federal law enforcement educator and SME for the high-intensity drug trafficking areas and Middle Atlantic Great Lakes Organization Crime Law Enforcement Network programs. Attendees who require passcode, the word for today is liability. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list located at the bottom of your screen. And just to know that all questions will be answered at the end of the program. Thank you all for attending today, and Dale, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about an issue that I'm very passionate about because I've been working in this area for 25 years. I was an educator. I did my time in 1980 teaching juniors and seniors American history, civics, and world cultures. What's interesting is that I never really got out of education because all these years later, we have 30,000 school clients, and we worked for the White House after Columbine. And one of the things that aggravates me and my team is this constant issue that we see when we do these reports for the Senate Judiciary Committee and the White House in the case of Columbine. We see the failure of administrators over and over again in policy and state and federal law. So I'm going to talk about this today. If you are representing or you are listening in on this and you are a private school, this is actually relevant to you too, because the Departments of Education in various states and certainly federal IDEA is relevant to private as well as public schools. If you're an attorney who is representing plaintiffs, this is certainly relevant. And if you're a defense attorney or counsel for a school board, this is very relevant. So let's get into these 5 issues and educate you. First and foremost, let's talk about facts. Now, you can go to the Juvenile Justice Bulletin, you can go to the Justice Department, Department of Education, and you can pull up this data on your own. This continues to be consistent every year. It never changes. Varies a little bit, but ultimately this is the seriousness of the problem. 2.7 million crimes are committed at schools every year in America. Now, that's public and private schools. Of those 2.7 million, and this is very important to those of you listening, of the 2.7 million, 70% are suburban and rural schools. So statistically, urban schools, city schools are not the problem. It's suburban and rural schools. Well, why is that? You know, we have city schools, we have rural schools, we have suburban schools. One of the problems with suburban schools is that they truly believe that because they pay higher taxes, and this is true, and because they live in what is perceived to be a safer area, they really ignore safety because once they've moved from the city to the suburbs, everything is fine. Well, everything is not fine. And the problem is that attitude is prevalent in suburban schools. Rural schools have the same mentality. And so the point I'm trying to make with the statistic is to show that everybody behaves badly. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic area level is and what geographic area you're in. Students ages 12 through 18 were more likely to be victims of non-fatal violent crimes such as rape, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault. Total crimes committed in schools of this age group, 253,000. Of that number, 60% are suburban and rural schools. So let's talk about sex assault. Sex assault is the most common violent crime committed in schools, both public and private. Arne Duncan, who I worked with in the previous administration, talked about this issue on a regular basis. In fact, one of his last official acts was to send out a letter about this, because one of the problems that has been pervasive for the past 20 years and well documented by the Department of Education and the Department of Justice is sex assault by students on other students. And where it happens primarily is special education classes. That's why the Department of Education requires schools, both public and private, to have a climate assessment done every year to get their special ed money. What's interesting is most schools have never even heard of this nor done one, but yet in their applications they say, oh yeah, we did a climate assessment, which is a management audit of the special ed department. When we do those audits of special ed departments, we find no one is compliant. And this is the reason why liability is a problem. This is why students are getting hurt. There's a management issue. We say at our company, a well-managed school is a safe school. And that has been true for 25 years. It can be true tomorrow, too. Next, teachers. Now, let me clarify this. The Justice Department uses that as a general term. It means teachers, teachers' aides, school counselors, and principals. So I want you to think in the totality of that, of those people are victims of over 400,000 violent crimes each year. 400,000. And this is increasing. This number is increasing dramatically each year. And again, what's the problem? The problem is the management of parents, the management of caregivers, the management of the classroom, the management of the schools. Management is the issue. And we see this at Parkland, and I'm going to talk about Parkland and Sandy Hook later on. But management is the issue. Let's talk about types of school violence. When people talk about school safety, it always amazes me when we get these cases in. And by the way, we represent schools and we represent students, plaintiff and defense. So we're not hired guns for one side or the other. It always amazes me how myopic, how really clueless, for lack of a better term, a lot of people are about the complexity of school safety. School safety is complicated. Police departments and security people shouldn't be doing any kind of auditing because police and security people don't know anything about LAA Minimum Standards. They know nothing about IDEA. They don't understand schools and how complex they are. So let's look at the types of school violence. Student to student, student to teacher, teacher to student, teacher to staff, staff to student, vendor to student, visitors to student, visitor to teacher. Now let's look at F, vendor to student. So vendors are the lady that brings in the soda each day, the people that drop off the food, insurance people that come in to sell insurance, any people that are not staff or students are vendors or visitors. Visitors and vendors account for a little over 30% of all the crime committed in schools. Well, what happens at schools? Private and public schools have the same policies, ineffective policies, which create liability and create danger. The vendor or visitor comes in, they sign in, they get a badge, and then this force field envelops around them so they can't touch anyone. What happens is that these people end up going throughout the school unescorted in many cases, with no escort, and they have access to very sensitive areas, and they have access to students. This is bad policy. Why do I know that? Because when the president brought us in 2001, and asked me to put together the National School Safety Task Force, which we recently revived down in Washington, he said, put together new policies for the Department of Education, which we did. One of them was that any visitor or vendor must be escorted. This is just common policy. No visitor or vendor may use a bathroom that students use. That includes construction people, everybody. And so this policy has been in place for a long time. But this is the complexity. This list is the complexity of school safety. It requires people knowing and understanding all the different moving parts of a school environment and all the laws, the local laws, the state, and more importantly, the federal laws. Number one, lack of accurate understanding of safety issues. So what happens after Parkland, what happens after Sandy Hook, any of these events, everybody overreacts. What they do is they spend a lot of money on cameras, primarily cameras. And so I have a question for all of you. How many of you have cameras in your schools? And if you have those cameras, how many of those cameras have cognitive function and peripheral vision? Because I'd love to see one of those. The only thing that has cognitive function and peripheral vision are human beings. One of the things that we found is that cameras make people lazy. Because what they say is, well, the camera will catch it. I know no camera that can reach out and stop a crime. And this is part of the problem. After Columbine occurred, $1 million of equipment was installed in that high school, which is obscene, just an obscene amount of money. What's interesting is you can go and Google News and you can find this. 6 months after the shooting, a kid walked in through all those metal detectors with a loaded 9mm pistol. So the question is, did they learn their lesson there? No, they did not. Did they learn it at Sandy Hook? No, they did not. Are they going to learn it at Parkland? No, it's obviously they did not and will not. Because the problem is management. The management of people. Students, staff, visitors. That's the bottom line. You cannot do that with equipment. Cameras catch things after the fact. We find that cameras really are plan B. They're really part of investigation. They do not stop anything. So the question is, what does your school system, or what does that public or private school system know about their safety issues? If you bring in security people, they're equipment people, and they're going to look at equipment. Equipment's part of the process, but it's a very minor part, ironically. It's so simple to stop the shooter issue because all you have to do is manage your classroom, manage the children in that classroom, and know what's going on with them, and intervene in their lives early. We see this at Parkland. 30 people knew about Cruz's issues and did not respond, did not do what the law required them to do. 30 people. At Sandy Hook, we found 6 violations of federal law. Over and over again, that school system knew there was a problem and did nothing about it. We see it over and over again. So let's talk about how you accurately understand safety issues in a school. You have to have someone go through that school that actually understands school law, understands school management, and that's not police officers and that's not security people. That's the problem. People do not understand what's going on. You have to look at discipline records. You have to look at policy. You have to look at lateness and absenteeism. It is complicated. And if you don't do it correctly, we're going to continue to see the problems that we currently have. They're not going to stop. Number 2, reaction, not prediction. Everybody reacts. Nobody predicts anything. Really ask the question, does the school system that you're thinking of right now, local, public or private, how much of their training is about prediction and prevention? Because an emergency plan is not prediction, it's a cleanup list. It's what you do after the fact. And any good attorney, any good litigator is going to say, you did nothing to prevent this. I mean, that's what liability is about. You just reacted to it. And this is a big, big issue because nobody is teaching prediction. They're teaching reaction. What to do if a shooter comes. Well, wait a minute. How are shooters developed? I mean, I teach for the Justice Department HIDTA and MAGLOCLEN programs, NYPD Detectives Division. I teach this prediction model, and it works. I've been teaching it for a long time. If you hear in my voice frustration, I'm very frustrated. I've seen too many dead children. I've seen too many ruined lives. This is preventable, and it just takes action on the part of professionals to do their job. Prediction is the key. You see this at Parkland. People knew what was going on, did nothing about it. I find it interesting that several weeks before the shooting, Cruz's therapist said he is not a danger to himself or others after trying to drink gasoline, gutting birds in his kitchen. We did a whole report on this. And this therapist said, no, he's fine. I haven't heard from the therapist since the shooting. I don't think we're going to ever hear from them. Over and over again, we see professionals that should know better that don't. Prediction is the key. Early intervention is the key. Number 3, poor management of schools. If you think about it, a 500 or 600 student school is a small village. So the people who are the principal and the school counselor and anybody in leadership position, paraprofessionals, are managing a small town. So the question you have to ask yourself as professionals is, well, who taught them management skills? Now, I was very proud and very honored to have been a student for 20 years of Dr. Peter Drucker. Some of you know who Dr. Drucker was, so you know the significance of that. For those of you who don't, you have your title because of him. This is the man who invented in the early mid part of the 20th century, he invented modern management practice. IBM going from doing typewriters to computers, the reworking of General Electric, and all of that was Peter Drucker. And management sounds boring, but believe me, management is key and important. One of the things he noticed in working with nonprofits and schools is the lack of management skills that professional administrators have. You have to learn how to manage. That's something that's natural. And so that's important. So number 1, poor time management. We find a lot of solutions to school safety issues are just managing time in a school more effectively. We see this all the time, especially with cafeterias. And that doesn't cost any money. You don't have to buy any equipment. That's just a matter of looking and asking yourself what's working and what's not. And by the way, people don't sit down and ask what's working and what's not when it comes to school safety. They have a conversation with some coffee in August because they're required to by state law. All 50 states require this. And nobody is really digging in and asking a thorough forensic assessment of what's really working and what's not. We see this constantly. Non-data-based decisions. Well, should we do this? Yeah, that sounds good. That is not how professionals make decisions. Decisions are made with data, with empirical data. What do you observe? What is replicable? We need data-based decisions. But to make data-based decisions, you have to look at the data. And this is part of the problem. We see this all the time with discipline records. Discipline records tell you a lot about the management of school and the quality of the principal, the quality of the people running those schools. School boards being asked to make decisions without essential data. I ask school board members all the time because I speak at school board conventions, do you require your superintendent, your special ed director to come and prove to you this information, or do you just take their word for it? Well, we take their word for it. You know, they're professional people, but that's not being a school board member. That means that you have to verify what they're giving you. In many cases, we find that school boards do not get briefed by the special education director. Unreal. The special ed director briefs the superintendent briefs the school board. The special ed director should be briefing the school board every time they meet, every single time with essential data so they can make accurate decisions. Poor use of technology to handle the mundane tasks. In many cases, things don't work. Software programs are not relevant to the school system that they're being used in. Every school system is different. Every school building is different. You have to, one size does not fit all, but yet when it comes to technology, nobody is customizing it to those school systems. They're just using off-the-shelf programs. And this is where we see a lot of problems in the management of people. Lastly, under poor management of schools, lack of effective ongoing interactive community-wide communications. You need to be communicating with the public on a regular basis. That means weekly. But the problem is the only time they communicate is when there's a problem. That is not effective. You have to be communicating with them. Now, a lot of times, and it's true, superintendents will say to me, school board presidents will say, well, local newspaper hates us. Okay, well, we have social media now. There are many ways to get your message across. You have a Kiwanis club. You have a Rotary club. Do you belong to them? Yeah, but I don't go. Well, that's your problem then. Go and communicate. Now, those of you who have contemplated litigation against a school system that's mismanaged, you need to ask those questions. All these things I've mentioned here, you need to be looking into those. You need an expert that understands those issues. Very important. All right, moving on. Excuse me. Lack of effective plans to combat truancy and lateness. So, truancy is the root of all school safety problems. Now, before you dismiss that, let me defend that statement. I made this statement back after Columbine occurred, and we were putting together this national report for the President and the Senate Judiciary Committee. So, I showed how truancy was a clear indicator of juvenile delinquency. You find children of any age who are having problems in school, and you're going to find truancy and lateness. And by the way, the federal government for the last 20 years, excuse me, the last 20 years has included lateness in truancy. In fact, if a student has been late 10 minutes or more, 4 times or more, that counts as 1 day of absence against that school system. A lot of school administrators don't know that. And it has to do with funding, it has to do with a lot of things. You look at truancy and lateness in that specific student that's having trouble, that is aggressive, that's violent, that is troubled, and not adhering to the rules. You're going to find that there's a dysfunctional family behind that. Functioning families do not send their children late to school or truant. And if you say, well, I disagree with that, that's okay, because it's true. It's a clear indicator of dysfunction. And right there, truancy and lateness can tell you a lot of what's going on about the management of that school system. Number 5, poor emergency management. So, back 15 years ago, the issue, excuse me, the issue for most schools was dealing with the electric wheelchair. They had a student that had disability issues, was in a very heavy wheelchair. How do you get that out during an emergency? That has changed a lot because of mental conditions such as autism. One of the things that boggles my mind, and I guess it shouldn't after all these years, is the fact that emergency plans in schools do not include a section on special needs students. And nobody's doing any kind of training for the staff on helping special needs students during an emergency. So autism is on a spectrum. You have Asperger's, which is on one end, and you have a much more severe version of that on the other. You have children with different types of developmental issues. One of the things we noticed is that when there's an emergency, these children lose it. They freak out. They lay on the floor, do a fetal position. If you're a parent and you ever tried to get your small child off the floor when they didn't want to get off the floor in a tantrum, even though they're 40 pounds, they can feel like 400 pounds. How are you going to deal with that? This is a key element of an emergency management plan and the training, because you're going to have to talk to that child's unconscious mind, use the right phrases and the right words to get them calm enough to follow you. And I'm telling you right now, it's not being taught. Also, I want you to think about the fact that you're going to have to use regular staff members to assist in an emergency, the special education department. Is that in your emergency plan? Do you have a team of people in each school that are going to assist the special needs department with these emergencies? This is key. This is key and very, very important to talk about. I'm very sorry about my coughing. So, emergency management training is so critically important, the understanding of how to deal with those special needs children. And also, what is an emergency? You know, that's a question right there. What's an emergency? Is it just a shooting? Is it just a fire? Is it just a hurricane? Well, it's more than that. It can be an angry parent. It can be a fight between a group of students. Emergencies can be multiple things. The problem is emergency plans in schools are thinking about 20 years ago. They're not thinking about today, not thinking about all the possibilities. You realize that last year in the United States, about 60 parents drove their cars into the front door of schools, right through the front door. This is a common problem. I mean, statistically, it's small, but it happens more than you realize. So the question is, well, are you prepared for all of that? You know, are you prepared? That is so critically important. So if you're a litigator and you are representing a student against a school, you need to make sure that someone is evaluating that emergency plan and its relationship to IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the LAA Minimum Standards, and the state safety and security protocols. So let's talk about that. In New Jersey in 2010, a very good group of security and emergency management protocols were designed. There's about 330 of them. Sounds like a lot, but a lot of them had subdivisions. But these were really good. Probably one of the best grouping of school-related security emergency management protocols in the country. Now, the Department of Education in Trenton, New Jersey said, you got to be compliant with these. Well, there was a problem. Most schools in New Jersey are not. Well, I know that because we work with a large portion of the schools in New Jersey, and we find that they were told by their attorneys, oh yeah, we're compliant with those rules. And then when we do the evaluation, because we know those rules very well, we find they're not compliant at all. So this is a problem. Not only is that a liability, but it's a management problem. You're talking about something that can affect people's lives. And so this is critically important. So next, before we go to questions, and we always have a lot of questions for this presentation, I want to talk about liability because that's the main focus here. Most school administrators are not that concerned about liability, and most school board members are not. And I know that's a general statement, but bear with me because I sit in the room with them when they're talking because most schools are insured through a subfund, an insurance subfund. So ultimately, everybody shares the risk. If there has to be a payout, everybody takes a piece of their action and pays out. At the end of the year, in most subfunds, the bulk of it is returned and they start all over again. I'm paraphrasing. But here's the issue now. Since Sandy Hook, things have changed. So what is happening now is that what used to be a thing where, well, the insurance will take care of it. Now the problem is that people, administrators, are being fired over these issues. Let's take a look at Sandy Hook. We were brought in to do a special report for the Senate Judiciary Committee. What really happened at Sandy Hook? Well, about 6 months after the shooting, the superintendent left. Well, the superintendent was actually fired. There's a lot of reasons for that, mainly because there were a lot of problems that the school board realized that they didn't understand before the shooting, sadly. And a lot of people's lives were affected by those shootings. And so now school administrators are realizing, I can actually lose my job. Principals can lose their jobs. School board members can not be reelected if they have these incidents. So now it's become a very personal thing. Now it's more than just the liability issue, which is no big deal because insurance will cover it. Now it's an issue of my livelihood, my status, whatever it may be. I have great respect for good superintendents. I have great respect for great principals. In fact, I have many administrators who work on my team for my company, many, and I love them, and they're fantastic. The problem is I meet so many that are not very good. I meet a lot of school board members who are taking that political step from school board member to county to state office and hopefully to Washington. And they're really there for a brief period of time. And then I meet school board members that really care about their community and they really want to see that school succeed. The question is, if you're an attorney and you represent a school board, you need to ask yourself some very difficult ethical questions. Are you dealing with professional people, both administrators and the school board, who are really understanding and educating themselves about the laws, about these rules and regulations, about the current state of school safety prevention methods? Because that's your responsibility. Secondly, if you're an attorney who does plaintiff work and goes up against private and public schools, you need to educate yourself also about these things. And you need to find out what the defense doesn't know, what they're not doing based on those standards. For example, now, as of 9/11, and recently this has become a big issue, Homeland Security has protocols on first-person shooter prevention and response. They're excellent. Most school security people don't know anything about them. If someone's in charge of the security for a school system, how would they not know those? They've been around for, 17 years. Do they know what the recommendations are from the U.S. Department of Education? Do they know anything about IDEA? Do they know their state regulations? These are all important questions that have to be asked and answered, and that's very, very important. So what I'm going to do now, I kind of move through these fairly quickly because we do always get a lot of questions. So I'm going to turn this back over to Rochelle, and Rochelle, you can feed me the questions and I'll answer them. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Dale. If all the attendees are in the passcode for today, which is liability, and any questions that you have for Dale. Our first question is, what do you think could have prevented the 2017 North Park Elementary School shooting in San Bernardino?
Well, any school shooting you're talking about the shooting by an outside party, if I remember correctly. Am I right about that? That was an outside party.
They didn't.
What's that?
They
I believe that
didn't
was from an. Okay, I think that was from an outside party, if I remember correctly. So here's the issue. Back when we had the National School Safety Task Force and we did the first report for Congress or for the Senate and the White House, one of the things that we put in place at the Department of Education was the outdoor security walks. So these are very, very important. Someone with a two-way radio every 30 minutes, we like to see them every 20, walks the perimeter of the building, looking for certain things. You have to train them on what to look for in cars, people behavior, things like that. And that way, you can report to law enforcement, directly to law enforcement or to the office that there is something suspicious going on. And we have found over the last quarter of a century that this process works very well for schools that actually activate it. So if I remember this case correctly, this was an outside agent, an outside person who came to the shooting. If I remember that correctly, there's part of the process is the outdoor security walk, and you don't need security guards for that. That can be done with the staff. We do this all the time. We ask for volunteers and we sign them up on a grid when we do training, and we always have more volunteers than we need. But if it is correct, if I'm thinking the same shooting, that would have prevented that because someone would have seen that this person was outside where they didn't belong, moving towards the school, and could have reported that in and did the lockdown. What's interesting is at Parkland, they had security personnel who were outside doing these security walks, but they didn't react because that's a problem. Because a security guard, and I want to use this as a moment to talk about security guards. Security guards from security guard companies are a liability. I want to say that again. Security guards hired from a security guard company are a liability for any facility. There are only 2 security guard companies in this country that we even recommend, and they're extremely expensive, and they're only for high-end companies and government agencies. Most security guard companies are really horrible. They pay very poorly. A lot of times they don't do proper investigation on these people. You know, they have criminal backgrounds. And their only interest is protecting the company, the security guard company, from liability, not protecting your facility and your people. You'd be much better off using law enforcement, SROs, which we're big fans of, something to that effect. Don't use outside security people. But anyway, hopefully I answered that question. I'll take the next one.
So next question. Let me just pull it up. Other than escorting visitors, what are the best practices for preventing visitor on student-teacher violence?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. Other than escorting visitors, what are the best practices for preventing visitor on student-teacher violence?
Escorting. They should be escorted, and if the teachers have been trained in prediction and prevention, which they should be, they're going to know who the volatile parents are, and they're going to keep them in a separate room and meet with them in a separate room, certainly not the classroom. This is all about management of the visitors and preventing that conflict, because that's something when we do training, we're always dealing with the teacher and parent issue, but also student and teacher violence. That's just an issue of managing the school and managing the classroom effectively. The question is, you know, are you managing those schools correctly? Anytime you go on YouTube, you can put in student attacks teacher, and the question is, when you read the articles in the local newspaper or watch the news reports, very little is done because they don't want to deal with the parents, because usually a student who's violent has parents who have emotional issues or violence issues. So again, it's about controlling those parents, getting law enforcement involved. And that brings up another issue. I'm glad you asked this question. Many times schools see themselves as the Red Cross. What do I mean by that? They think they're a hospital that fixes everything. Schools are not in the business of fixing people. They're in the business of educating students. And the problem is that because local social services in many cases are weak, many schools have had to take on the social services role, which I think is wrong and has created problems. And so one of the issues is they don't tend to get law enforcement involved very much at all because they feel they have to fix it internally. It's kind of a teacher mentality. Teachers have a certain mentality about saving the world and doing great things, and that's a beautiful thing. But the problem is that when you see aggression, you have got to jump on that very quickly. And you've got to send out a message to the community. We're not going to tolerate this. This is our house. We're here to protect the staff and students, and you will not act that way. And we're going to stand strong against that. And that's the best practice for that, is setting an example, and also the escorting and isolating problem people in there. And then also, are the principals really looking at the teachers and their ability to manage the classroom correctly? Because I'll tell you something right now, one teacher with poor classroom management skills affects the whole school. And we see that on a regular basis. So hopefully I answered your question.
Next question. What does LAA stand for in LAA Minimum Standards?
LEA is a local education agency. It's a federal designation. Any school is called LEA. So it always amazes me when I go to conferences to speak how all these security companies who are doing school safety audits, when I bring that up, they ask that question. That's disgraceful. If you're doing school safety audits and you don't know what an LEA is, I mean, that's basic education dialogue 101. So LEA minimum standards are set by multiple people. So the local education agency, the board, the school board, sets policy, board policy, and then the administrators execute that policy. So those would be minimum standards. But LAA minimum standards are generally what the state education Department of Education sets that they must meet educationally. So one of the things that's interesting is when you apply for federal grants as a school, reading, school safety, special ed, they always ask for your master calendar. Well, your master calendar tells them a lot about your school management skills. I'm down at the Department of Ed in Washington, 3-4 times a year, meeting with them, because we become the resource for information for our school clients. And the thing they tell us all the time is we can look at that master schedule and tell you whether they're managing that school district well or not, or that school well. So yes, it's all part of management, but that's a designation for a local education agency. LEA means a school. So.
Next question. As a parent of kids in public schools, I'm curious to know what, if anything, can I teach my kids to do while at school to minimize any risk of harm to themselves in general?
Well, the best thing you can do isn't really related to talking to your kids. It's about getting parents together and saying, we're going to write a letter to the school board and we're going to ask critical questions of the school board that we want answers to, and get 4 or 5 parents together and sign a letter, because if a letter is dated and signed under federal law and certainly under state law, it has to be responded to. If you just call or email, that's not valid. You have to put it in a letter form, especially with IDEA. So I would write a letter and I would ask the question, number one, how do you know specifically, how do you know what the issues are in the local school system, in my children's school? What have you done to assess those issues? That would be the first question. And then the next 2 would be related to what you are concerned about. And just ask those questions. Say, we would like answers, written answers to these questions. Now, what you're going to find is that most of the time they'll ignore them in many cases, or they'll give you very, pat, one-sentence answers. And that'll tell you a lot. But as far as a parent, telling their children, I'll tell you what I used to tell my kids, and my kids went to a Edison charter school, but I used to tell them, I go, look, make sure you help others. If something occurs, you go and you get the teacher involved, the principal involved, and if nothing else, if something occurs, you grab as many people as you can, as many kids as you can, and you get out of the school. Because in a school shooting, trust me, the live people are outside, not inside. And I'm qualified to say that. So that would be my answer to your question.
Question. What are the best practices for preventing teachers from sexually molesting students?
The reason why I laugh is teachers are the only certified professionals in the United States that I know of that are not required to take a psych evaluation before they're hired. So if you're a local police officer, state police, federal agent, police officers go through a psych evaluation. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. So one of the problems we have in this country and in Canada is that the fastest growing group of sex offenders, of adult sex offenders, especially in the United States over the last 5 years, are 20-something, early 30-something females. And if you do a search on Google News, you'll find more female names, probably 4 to 1 over males. And the problem is that when people are getting hired, human resources, and I do teach for SHRM, the Human Resources Association, and I can tell you that they are not trained to understand sexual issues and criminal issues in people and how to determine that in a job interview. And there are many things you can do in a job interview that do not violate federal standards, but you have to be trained how to do that. So you want to prevent teachers from sexually molesting students. Well, number one is don't hire people like that. Peter Drucker used to say you cannot make a good employee out of a bad person. And one of the problems that a lot of people have is they don't want to judge people. Well, when you were a child, and bear with me because this is an important issue. When you were a child, your parent would say to you, if you can't say something nice about someone, don't say anything at all. And that's beautiful for children, but that's ridiculous for adults. Because as adults, if you have a nephew or you have a friend who has a drug or alcohol problem, you're going to need to confront them. You're going to need to intervene. You're going to have to say something negative to them. And you're going to have to intervene in their lives or they're going to die or get hurt. So as adults, we need to be able to stand up and say, you know what, I need to evaluate this person, whether they should be around children or not. Well, that takes special skill beyond just the normal job interview. And that takes some research. It's not complicated. It doesn't take a lot of time, but you have to be trained to do that. Secondly, it's classroom management. Is the principal, who is the captain of the ship, he or she, are they managing their teachers well? Are they managing them well? Do they go in there and do they manage those teachers correctly? The other issue is school boards have to stop being scared of lawsuits. And what happens is these teachers who sexually assault, and I teach sex crime investigation for the Justice Department, for local, state, and federal law enforcement, you would not believe the number of teachers who local law enforcement, state law enforcement know are sexual predators who get hired at other schools because the school wants to get rid of them, doesn't want to deal with it, doesn't want the cost of firing them, and so they push them onto someplace else. And this is, and unions, teachers' unions cover this up, and I'm not anti-union, but that really, really aggravates me. So I don't think parents really understand how bad it is, how much of this is going on. And teachers know, the staff knows who's involved with whom, especially in high schools. But the problem is really about people showing leadership and standing up to this. So one is better hiring skill. Number two is better classroom management. Number three is when you have this kind of a situation, admit you have it, go through the process of firing them, go through the process of having them criminally charged and adjudicated, and make a statement, we're not going to tolerate this. And guess what? Then you're not going to have that kind of behavior. So that's my answer to the question.
Next question. Do you recommend arming teachers?
No. Teachers should be teaching. The only time that we've ever encouraged that in 25 years is with rural school systems where they were so far away from law enforcement and from any kind of fire rescue situation. We had to train people, administrators, certain people within that school system, how to defend themselves against a shooting, or also CPR, para-rescue kind of training, because it would be 20 minutes on a clear day for ambulance to get to them or police to get to them, or if it was weather problems, it could be hours. So that's the only time we've ever recommended that, just for practical purposes. But I will say this, teachers being armed is standard operating procedure in many European countries. It is done in South Korea, in schools in South Korea for the past 10 years. Most countries around the world have armed people within their school systems. And because we don't lead the world in mass shootings at schools. I know that's hard to believe, but if you look at the data, we don't. And the thing is that this is a very common practice around the world because it's a political issue here. Of course, it's one of those things people debate, but you can hire high-quality law enforcement. You can train SROs. You can have professional people that have been professionally trained to do that kind of work for you. I think teachers need to teach. Administrators need to administer the school and manage it. I think everybody's got to do their job. But I think in this day and age, you do need to have either fast response from local law enforcement, or you have to have someone there with professional capabilities. So that would be my answer to that question.
And our last question is a follow-up from the previous one. Why aren't psychevals required for teachers?
This is something that teacher unions have fought for many years. And frankly, again, I have no problem with the concept of unions. What I don't understand is why psychevals were not required and why the unions have fought those. Because, I mean, psychevals are done for doctors. They're done for all sorts of professions that are certified. I don't know why that's an issue, but it is. And, you know, someone's got to have the political will to step up and say, this needs to be dealt with. But people are very uncomfortable with sexual things, even professionals, I find. And so nobody wants to deal with this issue, and especially this rising issue of adult females sexually assaulting children. And ironically, over the last about 10 years, the fastest growing group of sex offenders in the United States and Canada are actually teen females, female adolescents. And they first offend when they're babysitting. NPR, National Public Radio, did a 4-part series on this, which was fantastic. I think you can see it on YouTube. But this would shock the world, would shock most parents to know this. People don't know what's really going on. They really don't. And that lack of education, that lack of training is really critical to this. There's so much, you know, that you can prevent and predict. And but back to the psycheval issue, that requires, you know, people to stand up and say, excuse me, we'll do this contract with your union, but your people are going to go through psychevals before they are hired here. And I think that's just common sense. Anybody who works around children should go through at least a basic psych evaluation. So anyway, so that would be my answer to that question.
We do have one more. What is SROS?
What is SROS? Are you mean talking about SROs? SROs are school resource officers. School resource officers were first developed in schools in North Carolina, 40 years ago. When you go south of the Mason-Dixon line, it's very common for schools, both public and private, to have SROs. In the north, you don't see it as much. Out west, you see them. In the northeast, you don't see them much at all, you know, from Chicago to over to New York and then down to about Baltimore. So they're school resource officers. They go through a special federal program that trains them how to do law enforcement within a school environment, K-12 school environment. They're very highly trained. Now, the SRO issue came up in Parkland, and so let me talk about that. There was a SRO there that did not go in, which he was required to do, and take care of the problem. And that gave SROs a bad name, but I'm going to tell you something. That's unusual. There are departments that are mismanaged, like the one that oversaw the Parkland shooting. And what they do is they give retiring officers the job of SRO because it's an easy gig. Well, being a school resource officer is not an easy gig. And it really requires a lot of attention to detail and good interactive skills. And again, this is where politics gets in the way of common sense and good safety protocols. But I will tell you that after 25 years, this SRO program is fantastic, saved a lot of lives, and it's something you should consider. I think every school system should have SROs. They're really powerful, and they solve a lot of crime. They prevent a lot of crime. It's just a great program. I'm a big fan. All of us are here. So.
We have 2 more questions. What are effective ways for schools to get young children to understand the nature of an emergency, such as by listening and remaining calm?
You can't. Young children are just young children. I mean, they don't, because of where they're at in their maturation, meaning their development, depending on their age, they just don't understand the severity of things. Even teenagers don't understand consequences. We now know that your portion of your brain related to consequences doesn't completely develop till you're 23, and anybody who went to college knows that's true. It's just listening and remaining calm requires classroom training by the teachers to learn how to control their classroom in an effective way, and teaching children to be quiet for periods of time. Good teachers will take a classroom of 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and they'll make them sit quietly and not move and not talk for 5 minutes. Even children with conditions like autism can do that. And that training helps the brain to develop that ability to stay calm and to listen and to follow rules. But, children are all trained to follow commands in kindergarten. I mean, that's where you learn them. You stand in line, shut up, and move when the teacher tells you to. That's part of social norming, it's called. So you learn that in kindergarten. They're already programmed to that. But in the emergency situation, it really takes a lot of work and a lot of training for staff to know how to manage kids, because if there's a real emergency, and I've been in 3 schools that had real emergencies, 2 that got hit by tornadoes while I was there, and 1 that had a gas line explode. So I know what it's like to help manage an emergency, 3 times in 3 schools. And I can tell you right now, those kids do not file out calmly. It's chaos. And if you don't train your people psychologically to deal with emergencies, they're going to fall apart. And so it really is about training the staff and the paraprofessionals and the administrators on how to work together. And most of that training is very poor. They do these tabletops that go on for 20 minutes. No emergency lasts 20 minutes. When we do tabletops, they last 2 minutes. We put people under stress. That's how you train people to do this. So that would be my answer to that question.
Question: are safety standards set at the district, state, or federal level?
They're set at the state and federal level, and that's a good question because sometimes the state regulations on school safety violate the federal law. So the Fed always trumps everything. And so in the case of IDEA, there are rules about school safety built into IDEA with special needs students, and they trump the state rules. And one of the things you need to understand as an attorney is that more and more of the attorneys that we work with that are plaintiff attorneys, we encourage them to do federal civil rights actions for their student plaintiff clients. And if you don't want to see those as a board attorney for a school, if you don't want to see those kind of federal suits, which are rough, then you need to ask the question of are we compliant with these state and federal regulations, and how do we know we're compliant? I just don't know a whole lot of people that know all those state and federal requirements. So that's very important in how you implement them. Because the Department of Education in Washington, they're not stupid people. They say to me all the time, we know when you're just writing it down to make us feel good, and we know when you can actually use these policies on a daily basis. We know the difference. So they're not getting fooled. But that would be my answer to that question.
Thanks, Dale.
Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it.
Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 60 minutes of this presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. And also, you will be receiving your certificates in 24 to 48 hours. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts for more than 60 years, TASA also offers free interactive webinars, expert written articles, research reports on expert witnesses, such as the Challenge History Report 2.0 and Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Dale Yeager for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Dale, if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. Thank you all for attending. This concludes our program for today.